This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the kickoff of the headless track of the JavaScript for WordPress. Don't tell the other tracks, but this one is going to be one of the best ones there is, and I'm really excited for our first presenter who's going to kick all of this off. Miriam is someone who I've gotten to know a little bit personally, but have loved all the work she's doing professionally, has a ton of background with agency experience and working in all sorts of different aspects to this work that we do. But recently, one of the cool projects that she's doing is Static, which is, I guess, an unhosting or a static hosting, a completely different way of working with WordPress hosting that is more secure, that is faster, and that hopefully we're going to hear a little bit about in this talk. So this talk is going to kind of kick off the track talking about the JAMStack in general, and I think you all are really going to enjoy this. So let me bring Miriam up on screen here to say hi, and then we will turn it over to her.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here. Should I just get started? I guess so.
Yes.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about the JAMStack. I mean, you're going to be talking about a lot of things related to headless, static, JAMStack. It's a really cool track that's going on. Overall, I think the content in this conference is amazing. I wish I could be in all tracks all at the same time, but I can't. But apparently they'll be recorded, so we can all enjoy them later. So what I'm going to talk about is the JAMStack and whether that is something that really works with WordPress or just, you know, these two kinds of worlds can't align. So just to start, I'll tell you a bit about myself. About 13 years ago, I founded a WordPress development agency based out of Israel, which is where I live, and built it up to be one of the leading agencies here. We worked with top tech companies and nonprofits and organizations, universities, and even some government, providing like high-level custom WordPress solutions. So I lived and breathed the agency life for a very long time. While I was doing that, I started a blog called WP Garage. It still gets quite a lot of traffic to the tutorials that me and my coworker Rebecca wrote, kind of documenting our journey as we learned WordPress and experienced different things. We felt like we should share what we were learning. I organized WordCamp in Israel 5 times. Yeah, that was a lot of times. And it was always great and fun. And then there was a limit put on how many times you could be a lead organizer, which was 2 times. And so I had to kind of pass the wand. Hopefully we're going to have WordCamp in Tel Aviv in 2020, so stay tuned if you're looking for an excuse to visit Israel. And more recently, I founded a company called Static, and as Zach said, it's kind of like an unhosting company, or the way we see it is the next step in the world of hosting. It's basically static and serverless hosting for WordPress websites. So let's go back to the beginning. What was the internet around 1999, 2000? It was a web made up of mostly static websites, right? When I started out, I started building websites and started to learn about them. It was basically, we were building static websites. They were a collection of HTML and CSS files, mostly. You know, I would use Dreamweaver, if any of you remember that tool, and some PHP includes for repeating like template-y type of parts of a page. But that was it. Those were the sites. And it was an interesting era of people kind of starting to express themselves online using pretty simple tools. And many of you might remember GeoCities, which was a glorious platform where anyone could, in a way, throw up onto the web whatever they wanted, whatever they were thinking, and create websites that looked like this. But it really started to give people the power and the freedom to express themselves easily online, and that was pretty cool. When I was preparing this presentation, I went back in the web archive to find what was essentially the first site that I built for my agency, pure HTML and CSS. This was kind of a standard layout at that time, and it brings back good memories. So this is where I started. And I started to offer this as a service to people. I'll build your business website for you. And people wanted it, but it got really annoying because it would be like, please, can you add a comma on the web page? No, not there, over there, and then, and add the word and. And I was just like, oh, okay, this is ridiculous. I specifically remember one client where we were going in circles for ages, where I was like trying to edit the content the way they wanted it, and it was a nightmare. So I started to explore the world of content management systems, and particularly the three big ones, WordPress, Joomla, and Drupal. And after investigating them, I fell in love with WordPress. I liked the templating system and the template tags, and I liked that it would be easy for my clients to manage their site and they wouldn't have to really bother me every second. And so I started to offer that as a service. And at that time, WordPress hadn't even reached version 3, so it was still mostly just considered a blogging platform. But it gave me the ability to give my clients a lot more power and abilities online. Okay, so what gave me and my customers the power? The LAMP stack, which was awesome. Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. And with that stack, anyone who knew how to essentially use Word could then edit pages online and publish them instantaneously. And it was amazing. And it was pretty easy for them to figure out how to use. It was all good. This is a image I took that kind of presents the LAMP architecture. It looks like a mess because there's a lot happening. The user opens, requests a page, and then it has to communicate with the server, query the database, process PHP, right? And then render the page for the user. So there's a lot happening. And in the beginning, 10 years ago to 15 years ago, that worked okay. Websites were not so complex, and the needs of the internet were much simpler. But as time has gone on, it's become more challenging. But basically, what we're saying is that it allowed us all to edit all the things, and it was amazing. It was a great era of the internet. But what we're seeing now is that as web pages and websites are growing in complexity, and there's more dynamic components on them, and they, the imagery is very important, and we all want to experience a more beautiful, useful, interactive web. It's making web pages heavier and heavier. So here's some data from a tool called HTTP Archive from Google, and you can do all sorts of interesting comparisons there about websites over time and web applications. So the median desktop size between March 1st, 2015 and June, so like around now, increased by 48.6%, and the median mobile increased by over 100%. And if you look at the world of WordPress, our world, while the increase isn't as dramatic, you can see that the number is much higher. The size of the average WordPress on desktop, or the median desktop WordPress site, and the median mobile also significantly bigger. And you can see in the WordPress communities, WordPress forums, and just generally online, how people are consistently looking for solutions for improving the speed of their site. It's a pretty big pain point. And if you look in the plugin directory, in the repository, you'll find tons of plugins whose entire goal is to help you optimize your site. There are various ways of caching, etc. So we know that there's the AMP project. I know there's going to be speakers about it today. AMP is an interesting project led by Google, meant to be open source and meant to make the web faster. So in my opinion, what AMP does is it tries to encourage all of us to adopt a new web format, where as HTML has been around, since the formation of the internet, and works well. I don't think that people need to be refactoring their websites or creating new mobile areas. It kind of reminds me of the days of the mobile WAP websites that were m.site.com. And that's the way I see it happening here. Responsive is brilliant because it allows you to retain the URL of your page, retain using HTML. Obviously, there's problems with it, as we can see with mobile page sizes going up, but I don't think that we need to be doing the web, and it's particularly not necessarily in a format pushed by a large organization like Google, and particularly when a lot of that involves kind of cannibalizing people's content. If you visit AMP pages, they're being served up from Google Cache, right, and on their URLs. And I know there's attempts to improve that, but even so, kind of masking, the solutions kind of mask what's really happening, which is that you don't own your web content when it's being served up through AMP. And that's one of the huge benefits of having your own website, as opposed to depending on social media or other third-party platforms to be the owners of your content. WordPress is one of the last bastions of where we can actually own our own online presence and our content. And then when AMP comes into play, it's not quite there. So that's my opinion on AMP. You are obviously welcome to disagree with me. It's very legitimate. But I think that we should rather be working with what we have to make it better. So, and this is just an example of how I'm not the only one who thinks that. There's like a letter written to Google about AMP, and there's a lot of content on there about the problematic aspects of it. So that's with regards to AMP. The web is not Google. It should not be just Google, right? Google already controls a lot. At least let's be able to retain our content. Website security is also getting harder. So these are just some examples of recent hacks that happened that were published related to WordPress plugins. Very often it's usually related to plugins. There were even recent hackers that, for some reason, they have something against WordPress, and so rather than responsibly publishing vulnerabilities that they find, they just publish them online, which puts everyone at risk. So this is just some example of what's going on in the world of security. Okay, so security, 90% of they have a very large footprint in the WordPress community, but 90% of the sites that have been infected are WordPress from what they see. And if you search, again, for WordPress security, you'll find tons of conversations, tons of posts about it, and tons of plugins coming to try to solve this issue. Another big challenge that we have in the world of WordPress is scaling. I don't know about you all, but we often had clients who were about to launch a campaign, and we knew that there was going to be a lot of traffic incoming to their site. So we would try to provision extra servers, extra resources, database servers, and whatever, and sometimes we would succeed. Sometimes we would over-provision, which would be expensive, and sometimes, which was the worst case, we would under-provision, and the site would become very sluggish or crash just when it needs to be alive. It's also relatively easy to DDoS attack. It's you don't need a lot of resources to DDoS a WordPress site. And in my agency, at one point, we actually accidentally DDoSed our own server because we were running something. And anyways, I was like shocked about how easy it was for us to do that. So scaling is definitely an issue. This is a resource created by Pantheon about how to scale WordPress. So that could be very useful, except for when you start to read it and you see that your standard user is not going to be able to implement elastic architecture, or real-world scalable architecture. They're not going to be DevOps experts and working on servers on that level. So this brings us to the topic of this talk, which is the JAMStack, or the stack previously known as static. So the JAMStack is a term that was coined by the founder of Netlify, Matt Bieleman, and it's meant to represent this next evolution of the web development stack. I think one of the reasons he coined this term is because calling something static sounds really, really boring and uninteresting, right? When you think of static, you think of something that's not moving, not dynamic, probably not interesting. But that's not at all what this static stack allows us to do. It can be very dynamic. So he came up with this term, JAMStack. It does not have to do with jam, no matter how delicious it may look. It has to do with JavaScript, APIs, and markup. So in the JAMStack, you're deploying websites or web applications that are being run off of JavaScript, which provides a lot of the dynamic components and functionality, APIs for managing the content, and markup for presenting. This article by Matt is from 2015 and is what triggered my interest in this whole area of web development. I read what he wrote, and he's clearly a visionary in 2015. At that point, people still didn't really know. I saw in many cases what he was talking about, but when he described how a site or a web application was built with a static site generator and was super fast, extremely secure, and scalable, it just sounded fantastic and amazing and dreamy, and I wanted a part of that because that was something that we were struggling with in my agency to achieve. It was an ongoing struggle. It wasn't set it and forget it ever. Matt had written that article on Smashing Magazine, and you can see about 2 years later, Smashing Magazine talks about how they worked with Netlify to refactor their whole site as a statically generated website, a JAMStack-based website, and it had been WordPress. So they were looking for the speed and the security and scalability that JAMStack brought. And Vitaly says about their WordPress site, even with a proper CDN, full HTTP2 support, and service workers in place, last year we managed to beat the performance results we had so far. However, even with a fancy Nginx build, performance we could get with a pre-built website enhanced with JavaScript was nothing short of breathtaking. So Smashing Magazine is a company that has teams dedicated to their website and web optimization. And even with all of those resources, they couldn't achieve what they could achieve by redoing the architecture to a JavaScript-based JAMStack site. So what are the general benefits of JAMStack, which I've mentioned a few times already? So they're fast. So if you think about it, if you think about that kind of terrible looking graphic that I showed earlier from Wikipedia about your standard LAMP stack, what has to happen in order for a viewer to view a page in a standard out of the box WordPress website, there's a lot that has to happen there. It has to query the database, it has to process the PHP. You have to hope that the underlying server, even if let's say all of that is pretty optimized, that the underlying server is not undergoing some kind of server load. With JAMStack, you're serving up static files, and you can serve up the whole site through a CDN easily, rather than just the static assets, like would be the case in your standard WordPress installation. So your results can be much, much faster with very little effort. Secure. So the screen that I showed with the vulnerabilities that happen almost pretty much every week in our world become irrelevant in the world of the JAMStack because the attack surface is basically eliminated. There's none of the endpoints, the database that can be breached, and PHP, which could be outdated. There's so many parts to your standard LAMP architecture that could have a weakness or vulnerability, whereas with the JAMStack, pretty much all that is gone. And so the bots that are scouring the web trying to breach websites will just hit a wall. Even if the underlying code of a, let's say, statically generated WordPress site, which we'll get to, still looks like WordPress, there's nothing to breach there. By the way, there is still the risk of front-end types of attacks. On HTTP Archive, there's kind of a scary statistic about how something like 86% of all websites have JavaScript with a known vulnerability. Yikes. I do think that that's possibly the next threat that we're all going to have to deal with. But in the meantime, that's still a tiny, tiny part of the world of security of web applications. And by running a site as a JAMStack, all of that becomes relevant. Scalability. So in order to generate each page, which is a relatively complicated process with LAMP, you need a lot of resources. And you need to make sure that you have enough of those resources and that you're never running out of them and all of that. So it can be challenging and expensive to scale your standard LAMP-based website. Whereas with the JAMStack, again, static files, you can essentially scale it infinitely. And that means you don't have to have DevOps and like be busy with that kind of stuff in order to make sure that your site continues to run smoothly. And of course, in many cases, it can be much cheaper when you're serving up static files as opposed to running your standard LAMP-based server. If you're running on Amazon and you're using EC2, then that can be quite expensive. Serving up static files can be pennies. So, but what does this all mean? Are we going back to the era of GeoCities? While that sounds very nostalgic, no, we are not. We're talking about a very different approach to building a static website. Netlify put together this directory of static site generators, which is very useful, and they rate them by popularity and things like that. And you can see, it kind of reminds me of when I first started out with WordPress, all of the PHP-based tools, open source tools that were being released all the time for every little thing, forums and this and that. And we're seeing that with the static site generators in terms of how all of the options that are out there. It's really interesting to see what's going on. So here are just some of the more popular examples. There's Hugo, Jekyll, and Gatsby. And Gatsby at the moment is the pretty much the most popular one, and it has a very rich community around it that's building tools and contributing to it. It's really interesting to see what's going on there. There's another really interesting one called Eleventy. It's worth checking out. It's kind of become like a favorite with certain developers. So anyways, it's really interesting. And you can see, if you look at Google Trends, how the term static site generator is gaining interest. Around here, people probably still don't know about it. It's definitely picking up and definitely a part of the conversation. Here are just some of the tools and platforms that are available for people to use when deploying statically generated websites. So of course, there's Netlify, which is in many ways a leader in the field. AWS, of course, with S3, and serverless can definitely play a role here in terms of generating or offering dynamic functionality without having to run an underlying processing server all the time, right? Just gets triggered, does its thing, and then spins down kind of thing. Here, serverless is more, while it's called serverless, it's actually a framework, which can be used to build web applications. We use it quite a lot at Stratic. So if it's so great, why isn't everyone using JAMStack? So even though it has those benefits, it has some challenges. In order to manage a JAMStack site, either it has to have been built in a way that ties it to a content management system of some kind. Could be a headless CMS. It could be one of the ones that are out there like Contentful or Forestry. But even so, it's not as flexible, and in many cases you need to start getting into the code in order to get it to do what you want it to do. It's not as simple as in WordPress where you generate a new page or like add a new widget or whatever. You have to then, if you're creating a new area of the site, you need to reconnect things. It's not necessarily so simple. There's a lot of Git being used for version control. Again, if you think about the standard person who's managing content on a WordPress site or any CMS-based site, they're writers or business. They're comfortable with that and not necessarily with a more technologically oriented content management process. So there are some CMSs that are available, but they're not seamless. It's not like out of the box you click, 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 and you've got a statically generated site with perfectly integrated CMS. It doesn't work that way. The publish time, build time can be quite long. There's definitely efforts being made to shorten it, but every page exists on its own, right? There is no templating system like in WordPress where header is applied to every page. Every page has to be built. Even if that header repeats itself, it has to be rebuilt because it's an HTML page, essentially. There's not really multi-author capabilities, although, again, there's efforts being made there. It's complex to develop and add on to it. At WordCamp Europe, I was talking to an owner of a WordPress related company, and he was talking about how happy he is. He's a very technical guy, but how happy he is that his marketing people just, use Elementor, create a new landing page, move things around, click publish, and they can do what they need to do without having to rely on developer resources. And there's a limited plugin and theme ecosystem for these platforms. And of course, people like what they're used to. So JAMStack is something that developers love. and it's definitely being embraced in the developer community, and less so among marketers, content managers, and creators because of the tech challenge. With WordPress passing a third of the web and growing month over month, and just here's some stats that were put together by Yoast to compare the CMSs, and just to give you an idea of how WordPress consistently grows, right? Green is growth. You can see other platforms grow, but often stay in around the same range. But WordPress really significant growth month to month. It's not going anywhere. So even if we, and I do think it has like a very strong future because it's such a huge portion of the internet, plus all of the developer community and agencies that are built around it and are familiar with it, and of course the content managers who are requesting it. So even if we look at this slide with the static site generator trend, if you then compare it to WordPress and Google Trends, you'll see that it's still just a blip kind of on the screen. You know what I mean? When it becomes relative, WordPress is still much, much bigger. We can see the downward trend, which should concern us and definitely needs to be addressed. But by far, it's still getting the most interest and the most conversation. This is an example of a developer who kind of came to terms with the fact that even though he doesn't love WordPress, it's still the best solution in many, many cases. And this is something that I hear very often. Many developers, WordPress isn't necessarily perceived as the coolest platform or the most cutting edge platform. And that makes sense, seeing as it's essentially like 15 years old, even though it's consistently being developed, which by the way is definitely an advantage. It's still in so many cases the best solution out there for so many people, for so many organizations, so many companies. So, despite developers' dream of moving into something that's cooler, shinier, and newer, clients want WordPress, and they realize that in many cases this is the right tool to offer. So I've looked for every reason not to use it, but it's tough to beat WordPress's portability and extensibility. With that being said, I will continue to look for creative ways to use it by deploying static with services like HardyPress or as a headless CMS. So I think that's a lot of the conversation that's going on. So where does WordPress fit into this kind of future? So first of all, there's the WP REST API, which is a very exciting development in terms of making WordPress more compatible with the headless CMS approach and a front-end development processes. However, in my experience, and in our experience at Stratic, unfortunately the WP REST API is it's not comprehensive enough. So you can't depend on it to necessarily catch all the content, and you have to tweak it a lot, or even extend it in order to properly capture all of the content on your site that you might want it to have in it. So in our case, we actually developed our own API for WordPress. But in any case, this is what the REST API looks like. Here it is in a friendlier fashion, and it grabs the content and presents it in JSON format. With the REST API, WordPress can be used as a headless CMS. So the scenario is that the backend, the WordPress admin, is used as usual. That content is deployed by the API, which can then be pulled into any front end, essentially. You could use React, you could use anything. And then that could also be easily deployed to other formats, other platforms, right? So it makes it very flexible. I like that someone put it this way: API only, UI anything. So what are the pros and the cons? So the pros are of a headless CMS approach is that it's cooler, which is definitely a pro and should not be belittled. It's portable, fast, secure, right? Because the front end that's being visited by the web does not have the underlying LAMP architecture, future-proof. It's a higher barrier, but the cons are a higher barrier of adoption. It's more complicated. There is a sense of vendor lock-in because it's not like your standard WordPress format. The front end can be developed in, endless ways. You don't have live preview. You actually can't use every plugin that you would want also because it's not tied automatically into the front end of the site. There's the static plugins. So this WP to static is under continuous development by Leon Stafford. And what they do is they allow you to generate a static version of your site, either on your own server, or you can deploy it to other places like Netlify or S3. So my thoughts on those is that, okay, it's really easy to install a plugin, right? Everyone can do that. And they're very low cost. That's definitely a benefit there. And you can use your WordPress as usual, because then it just generates the front end of the static site and deploy to the static hosting of your choice. But what we've seen from testing and from people who come to us after testing it, it's not completely reliable. Also, you're putting a lot of load on your server. A static build process on a WordPress site, it's resource intensive. So that's that, but it's an interesting direction. Oops. Gatsby Themes, being led by our very own Zach Gordon, is very interesting new approach. Also, woo! Yeah, woohoo! Like, definitely, it's very cool. It's definitely a clear connection between the more legacy world of WordPress and the more modern world of the static site generators, particularly Gatsby, which in many ways has a similar ethos to WordPress in terms of the open source nature and the community. It's really cool. So that exists, and you can check it out. And Gatsby has pretty good documentation about using it with WordPress. Some thoughts about that is that also it's more so you can use that out of the box, right? Because they've created these themes, but those themes are limited. And if you want to extend that, then you already need to have more serious developer chops. And it's possible that we'll see like that approach grow with more themes. But it's kind of like a branch off of your standard WordPress theme ecosystem. Still really interesting. These two I did not know about, but there was an article, I think, a post yesterday. I don't even know what date it is, or 2 days ago on WP Tavern about how JAMStack is becoming part of the WordPress conversation, and it was really interesting. You should check it out. And it mentions, a lot of different approaches, including these two tools. This is only in GitHub. This has a plugin, but then all the documentation in GitHub about how you can have a build process that deploys WordPress sites to Netlify. Again, not simple, very interesting. So yeah, modern web app, fast, secure. So all of that, Gatsby and those two are modern, fast, secure, and scalable. Definitely has a cool factor. Technically complex, depends on the REST API, although I'm not sure about those Netlify build processes. I didn't look into them more closely. Again, no preview, limited plugins, like the same story in the static build process. Okay, so then we come to another approach, which is using WordPress itself as a static site generator. And some examples are HardyPress and Shifter, and of course, Static. And this is my zone. So I'm going to talk about how I see it and what I think about it. So basically, in our case, it's Static, HardyPress, and Shifter all have a similar approach to what we do. I can speak most accurately about how we do things. So you have your WordPress site, and it's hosted on our platform. And it's the same with them. These are end-to-end platforms where it replaces your hosting. And in our case, your WordPress site sits in a Docker container. And when you want to use your site, you are authenticated by Static, and then it spins up the container. And that adds another level of security, because the site essentially doesn't exist when you don't need it to. And that's what's kind of crazy about the world of WordPress, which is that the underlying engine is always running. Even though if you talk to hosting providers, they'll tell you that it's a crazy statistic. Something like 90% of websites are almost never updated, right? And then you've got this kind of vulnerable, heavy resource-intensive thing that's running all the time for someone to update a page once a year. Of course, people update their sites more frequently, and they should. And so in that case, it makes a bit more sense. But in a way, it's kind of like leaving your car engine running all the time or something. So in our case, that's not what happens. It spins up. You manage your site as usual. You can add plugins, whatever you want to do, change themes, etc. And then you click a button to deploy the site as static and to start the static build process. Now, what's nice in my subjective opinion about our approach is that when you click the button, a lot of things can happen, right? So first of all, there's the standard thing, which is that we generate the site as a collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We use some serverless functions, which I'll get to. And we can do other things there as well because it's an end-to-end platform. So for example, we can optimize your images for you on the fly. We can potentially, and this is like my dream and on our roadmap, make your site accessible, which is a very complicated thing to do. But we could do that on the fly. There's so many opportunities we can add. So I mentioned JavaScript potentially being a future vulnerability that we need to be concerned about. We could add content security policies to the site, which we already do in a limited fashion on the fly, so that every site has that front-end protection, right? And that's generally complicated for people to do, and we could do that automatically when all by our user clicking a button. And the goal here is that everyone should be able to get the best site that their site could possibly be, the fastest, most secure, most stable, etc., even most accessible. So the site gets generated a collection of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files and gets served up through CDN with all of the goodies that it should have, like SSL with no mixed content. I was just on a site yesterday that had mixed content, and I couldn't believe it. It was like a major corporation. It's still a thing. We add serverless functions to emulate certain dynamic functionality like forms. So that's just one example, and that's also the advantage of an end-to-end platform. So rather than having an underlying processing server all the time, we can do it in specific areas when needed. The pros, are all the pros of having a statically generated site. In the case of these end-to-end platforms, it's just generally through the click of a button. You don't have to configure anything. And all of that stuff, CDN, HTTP2, SSL, gzip, serverless forms. We, on the fly, replace all of our users' search with Algolia, so they go from having like not great search, to say the least, which is native WordPress search, to having the best search available on the market, and other optimizations on the fly. So, but there are limitations with platforms like ours, which is that out of the box, it doesn't support certain dynamic functionality, like a WordPress form plugin. So we support some, but not all yet. Ajax Get, like infinite load, not supported because there's no communication with the database. More obvious types of sites are membership sites that have logins, and WooCommerce. What's interesting about this trend of the JAMStack is that in parallel, there are a lot of tools and solutions being developed that work really well on static sites in general. So for example, comments, of course, there's Discuss and Facebook comments, and there's other third-party comment solutions that have been developed that can be integrated. Even there's membership site solutions. There's one that was just launched on Product Hunt that was developed with Webflow in mind, but it's the same use case. And with regards to e-commerce, there's even headless e-commerce like BigCommerce, which could work quite well on a statically generated site. There's a build process in the case of all of these platforms, which takes longer than your standard publishing. Because we control the process from end to end, we were able to come up with a way to make the build process, even for a large site, for the changes to appear on the prod site on production to take 1 to 2 minutes. But that's just because we can control everything and we can do it. So what's the future of WordPress? I really like this tweet by Nivi. And he says, WordPress has such an awesome community. It makes WP always relevant no matter what the new hot stack is. He wrote this with regards to today's conference. It's awe-inspiring, really, and he misses this. We actually worked together on organizing WordCamp in Israel, and now he lives in Canada, so it's a bit harder to do that. But it's true. I think one of the biggest strengths of WordPress, aside from its huge market share, is the community around it. And that's why even if there's a cool new stack, WordPress is, I think, will pretty much always be relevant. The question is, what do we do and how do we align ourselves with these modern web trends that are definitely right, but so is WordPress. So let's continue working to bring WordPress into the future and sustain it for many years to come by seeing what we can do to bring it in line with these modern trends, making it more future-proof and making sure that it's still very relevant 5, 10 years down the line until the internet stops existing and we just all become bored. So that's it. Thank you.
is there any good alternative to Netlify in terms of pricing and features? They seem to be crushing it. Any thoughts around that?
Another interesting company that's similar to Netlify is Zeit, Zeit. I would check that out. You know what was I saw? I met a company that was really interesting at WordCamp Europe that has like a cPanel for AWS, so it makes it more accessible. And then users could actually use like S3 and CloudFront and even serverless, maybe in a more user-friendly fashion. Anyways, that was an interesting way to be able to use the cloud tools in an easier way. But yeah, Netlify, what can I say? They're the leaders in this field and definitely crushing it in many ways because they're really innovative and really cool.
We have one more question here. For a simple WP to static site, maybe 5 pages with no blog, can the plugin to output a static site be run on a local laptop using local by Flywheel? From Liam. Great question.
Really good question. I was just talking to a company where they have the WordPress site either local, I think local, and then they deploy it somewhere else, and that did work for them. I don't know what site. Like if it's a small site, I imagine that would work. I don't see why not. Once it gets bigger, then that becomes the challenge. Transferring all the files and everything and making sure everything's in place and working properly. There's a lot to check out. That's why, by the way, one of the things that we offer on Static is a preview static version. So like if you're running your static site on production on Static and you want to add a plugin, but you don't want to test it by publishing it to your static, production site and being like, oh, oops, I guess it doesn't work. You can first do it on a preview site. And so like that's why like when the site gets bigger, it's important to have those types of things. But small, probably would work. Yes, there is the WordPress website, really good. Someone just mentioned it. Also, Advanced WordPress is a very good Facebook group.
I love it. Well, folks, thank you again for those tuning in. Miriam, I am so grateful for you coming to this event and kicking this off. I could not think of a better person to do this. So thank you. Keep on rocking, do all your stuff. Folks, everybody watching, go follow Miriam. Stay tabbed on what she's doing. This is very good work and a very cool person. So thank you again so much. We're going to sign you off here. And folks, if you have questions, please follow up with her directly.